Okay, so welcome everyone to XBOSoft's quarterly webinar. And this quarter we have a special guest, Jennifer Bonine, and her colleague Rick Faulise, and they're going to be talking about overcoming virtual challenges and how to work successfully with virtual and remote teams. And I see this hashtag here, fake data, so I would imagine it has a lot to do with data. Is that right, Jennifer?
Yeah, tons of information on just how do you communicate, virtually and share information so there isn't misperceptions on those.
Okay, great. We can move forward here. So firstly, we have a couple house rules. The first one is that all the participants are muted, but we are taking questions through the question panel through Zoom, so feel free to ask questions. We will be monitoring the Q&A quite carefully and make sure that you get your questions answered. If not here during the webinar, then later on either in a blog or some follow-up posts via social media. If you could forward it one slide, please. Okay, so my name is Phil Liu, and I usually moderate these webinars. But today's webinar is not really about me. It's about Jennifer and her colleague Rick, and they're going to be sharing with us a lot of things about using data in the software Q&A process and how to, I guess, get rid of fake data. So let's move on. Fake data. Okay, Jennifer, I'll just let you go on from here. And I forgot to mention that I kind of will be representing the audience. So when they type in questions into Q&A, I'll be kind of interrupting you if you don't mind and asking questions. So I'll let you take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Phil, for having us. And I've got Rick, Faulise, and myself here. So thanks for joining us, everyone. We're going to be talking about how you use data and results to help you drive decisions, and also looking at that data from different ways to understand how others view data and information when they see it. We all know, and Phil mentioned remote and virtual teams. One of the challenges we see with being virtual or remote from some of our coworkers is misperception and a lack of understanding. We actually, I was talking to someone yesterday and had just a situation where Rick and I were dealing with a group of people who does automation remotely from their development team. And the perception was that when they would ping them on Skype and they didn't respond for a couple of hours, that they weren't working or they weren't doing work because they couldn't reach them instantaneously on a chat system or Skype. Well, come to find out, based on being VPN'd in and remote, the Skype channel for them doesn't update automatically. So it takes sometimes hours, if not overnight, before they see the new information. Not to mention that I don't know how many of you do any coding in your jobs every day, but as we mentioned to them, sometimes when you're coding and your head's down in that work, you're not checking chat channels and your email. You're very focused on the task at hand in that coding. So one of the things we had to do was portray some data which actually showed how much work was getting done, as opposed to that misperception that was going on that if they didn't respond within X number of seconds to a chat message, that they weren't working or they were doing something else or playing ping pong, who knows, right? So that happens a lot, I think, in organizations today, especially with how many remote people we all deal with, just by the nature of we're not all necessarily always have the luxury of sitting next to the people we're working with. So we'll do, for you guys, leading into that, we'll do some introductions of Rick and myself. As Phil mentioned, we don't have to wait for Q&A till the end. You guys can do it throughout the presentation. We put up contact information if there's anything you guys have questions afterward, or particular things that you wanted to know and had questions for us. That's a good way to get a hold of myself if you need anything at the end. We always say what makes these good, even though we're all virtual, right, and not sitting next to each other, is the more input and dialogue Rick and I get, and the more information, the more that all of us will get out of it, and the more interactive we can make it. We know that's harder because we're not all sitting in the same room, but through that chat window that Phil's going to be monitoring and working as your advocate in this presentation, we want to make sure that we get as many questions and ideas generated as we can. So I want to start with that just so we get a little practice doing that. And what I want to is all of you are the folks that are out there listening to this decided to join us today for a particular reason. You obviously wanted to take something away or had something that's on your mind that you wanted to learn. So if you could post in the chat window for us what you wanted to learn or leave with today, it helps Rick and I as we go through this to make sure we hit on those topics that are really top of mind for you guys as participants. Because again, this is really all about us sharing with you what's most relevant to you and where you're at today in your organizations. So I'll give you guys just a second to think on that and then make some posts. And then Phil, when you are starting to see some of those come through, maybe let us know what you're seeing.
Okay, no problem. I'll do that.
Thank you.
Well, some guys, Kelly has discussed talking about the best meaningful metrics given the audience. I guess what metrics are good for what audience is really the question.
Ah,
always
good one. Okay.
One. Yes.
Yep. And Kelly, towards the end here, we're going to show some different metrics, and not only the key will be not only individual metrics, but also metrics that, as Rick likes to say, what do we call it? Counterintuitive. So counterintuitive metrics, where if you're just measuring in one direction, people tend to do only that thing. So you want those counterintuitive metrics to make sure that you're getting an accurate picture.
Another one is another question about because the hashtag was fake data. So what kind of metrics should we not worry about, or things that we shouldn't be concerned about?
Ah, interesting. Yep. So the reverse side of that, what don't we worry about in terms of data and metrics? So Rick and I will talk a little bit about the ones that we do measure. He will talk about, with some of the new open source tools, they measure a lot of things, but sometimes the things they're measuring, if you don't measure anything else, aren't the right things to focus on. And where that can go badly, organizations that have focused on a single metric, such as code coverage, and when they just focus on code coverage, the issue that you can have, other ones where they focus on lines of code, that's an older metric, but that was a dangerous one for tracking developers by how many lines of code they create.
Right. Here's another one from Crystal, and I guess it's kind of similar to the one from Kelly. Kelly was talking about metrics per audience, but Crystal is asking about the most useful metrics. I would guess that independent of audience, there are some metrics that are, just great for everyone. So that would be a good one too. Perfect.
Good. All right. We'll give you guys like another 15 seconds if you joined. What we were doing is putting in the chat window what your key learning or what you want to take away from today, to make sure that we target the things that are most relevant or important to you guys, because it's all about you today. So give you another few seconds. Philip will let us know. If we get something after we move on from this slide too, we'll have Philip chime in, but wanted to just in the beginning kick off here with understanding what's really top of mind for you guys.
Okay, I think that's about it. Let's keep going.
All right, so a little bit about Rick and I. Data is a lot about visuals and making people remember things. So a lot of times, instead of giving them just numbers, it's better to give a visual. So Rick and I, when we introduce ourselves, we like to give pictures because it's more likely that you'll remember the picture than you may even remember our names. So for myself, I have a long history in consulting, also working for large technology organizations. A small little company called Oracle was one of the ones I spent a good amount of time at. I joke about that because we, on average, I was working in merger and acquisitions on some of the things we were purchasing and the companies we were buying at Oracle. And at one point, we were averaging almost one a day And that was some smaller ones. Obviously, with the bigger ones, most people heard about in the news, but it was almost one a day for a while on what we would purchase. And so I have some experience in that, work directly with senior leadership and executives. The names that you hear on the financial statements were the people that I worked directly with all across the globe, along with implementing big data, lots of new technologies out there. So lots of experience working with executives and understanding what they need. I'll let Rick introduce. Oh,
when you talk about the executives and the financial statements, I guess there's a lot of fake data there.
Yeah. Those are the people that go to prison if they don't do it correctly.
That's right.
Yep. And I'll let Rick introduce himself as well. I know I'm making him do the work today.
We can't hear you too well, Rick. Can you speak up a little bit?
I'm trying to get closer to the microphone here. So I started my career years ago as a developer and worked for a very long time in the development side of the fence, doing everything from COBOL framework all the way to web development to some app development before I left and joined the QA world. And I've spent test automation, performance testing, pretty much all that really nerdy stuff the guy in the back of the room that doesn't talk much does. That's where I've spent a large majority of my time. The last 15 years, I've been a QA consultant doing kind of anything you could imagine. I've come in to help just modify things, tweak things, make them better, all the way to actually implementing a full CI/CD DevOps tech stack from the ground up. So I've got a lot of experience with trying to relay the work that we're doing and trying to do a good job in explaining what it is we've actually done, since most people don't see a tangible outcome from the work I do. It's a lot of behind the scenes, and you kind of get a little graph of what it is, but they don't understand the full volume and effort that actually went in behind an entire team of people.
All right, so what we're going to do is one of the things that we like to ask the audience again, so just like what you wanted to get out of the presentation, what is the key metric or what are you measuring? So measuring can be not just about what code you're working on, but what are you measuring in terms of your people even? And are you measuring anything in regards to people? That's a big one for a lot of organizations, and how effective they are. So really quickly, key metric that you're measuring today. If everyone could throw one out there, we're going to speed capture metric so we know what you guys are using. You can say I'm not measuring anything. So if you aren't, that's a thing too.
I think a lot of people are not measuring at all, but I think probably one of the most common ones has to do with defects that get into production. That would be one. And then from what I've seen, I see a lot of people being afraid to measure people, basically, because thinking that it's going to get people fired and so on.
Yeah, that's one today. When Rick and I have done this session with others, we've gotten a lot of people that looked at us and went, I'm not really measuring anything. So that's good to know too, right? Because you need to know where you start from. So defects in production, not measuring anything. Yeah. Anyone have anything else? So.
Crystal talks about bugs in developer code.
Bugs in dev code. Okay. Okay. This gives us a good idea of where you guys are starting from. So that's why we asked this question too is, what are you doing today? And that tells us what to give you for some ideas of what maybe you could be measuring that you're not.
Right. Here's another one on number of releases that QA has signed off on. So I guess there are probably releases that QA signs off on and releases that QA does not sign off on. And there probably is some sort of a metric or percentage based on that.
Interesting. Okay. All right, we'll give you about 10 more seconds. If you didn't put anything, this just again gives us a good idea of where everyone's at.
Well, another one that is cyclomatic complexity that, is a metric that's measured by a lot of those white box testing tools.
Yep. Okay. All right. All right, so here's what I've got. Number of defects in production, bugs in development code, number of releases that QA has signed off on, and cyclomatic complexity. Those are the ones I heard. All right.
Yep.
All right, we're going to go with those for now. So that's an idea just of what some of you said, and there's obviously more of you than that. So some of you may actually not be measuring much or anything today. So a good idea is understand what you should measure. And one of the things we always talk about is actually measuring things around your people. So an interesting metric for you guys around business benefit to teams and how they perform is that better connected teams will outperform your average team by 3 times. So if the teams rate themselves as being well connected to their peers, the other members of that team, they will perform 3 times better than a team that rates themselves low on how connected they are to the other team members. I'll give you a little explanation of how this works. So what happens is when all of us run into issues during the day, we can either choose to sit and kind of struggle and figure it out by ourselves, or if we understand what the strengths are of the other team members and what they bring to the table, we reach out to them and say, hey, I know you're really good at this. Can you help me out? And we maybe get an answer in seconds or minutes as opposed to hours, right? So that speeds up velocity and the ability to perform as a team. One of the things companies say as they grow in size is that we lose the ability to know what the strengths are of the team members on the individual teams. So imagine you're a company of 50 people. You probably know the names of all 50 people. You know what those 50 people are good at. You've talked to probably most of those people. You have a good handle on it. The interesting thing is, as you get into larger companies, now imagine your company is 2,000 people, 10,000 people, 50,000 people. It's hard to know what everyone's strengths and weaknesses in those organizations are. So one of the things we're actually seeing is technology that links internally the profiles of the individuals in the company so that when you run into an issue with, say, creating an automation framework or testing a particular type of mobile application, you would have a way to ping that system, find other people in the company that you may not directly know that have experience in that, connect with them, and get that information. Huge benefit to organizations to actually connect all the knowledge that sits in that company to one another. Because there's a lot of untapped knowledge, especially in large companies, that they don't utilize today. So something to think about that companies are trying to measure is how connected are the different people in my organization, because the more connected they are, the higher performing we are as an entire organization and team, instead of operating as individual little silos. Phil, did you have a comment on that one?
Well, I was just wondering, and I'm sure that you'll get to this, is, how do you define connectedness, and therefore if you can only define it, then you can measure it. So I'm really excited about this, because I've always, if you do a lot of reading, what you said is true in terms of, organizations, but also animals in the wild. If you get more than 50, they don't communicate very well together.
Yep.
Yep. And by the way, another metric came in was automation coverage. So
automation coverage.
Hopefully we can kind of get to that as we go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So we will talk a little bit about, there's several ways to make sure your teams are better connected and strategies for that. So if you read books, again, storming, forming, norming, performing, the way teams that work every day together versus teams that work occasionally versus organizations where you never work with those people, but you want to be connected to them. So the definition of connectedness is based on if it's your primary team that you work with every day, right? And how connected you are to those individuals. So it would be similar to an exercise in an organization of where you would say, what are our organizational goals? Would your team be able to say and consistently answer the question, what is the goal of our team? And what are we trying to achieve? If everyone in that team can answer and has the same or very similar answer, that's a well-connected team. They understand what the goal is. They understand what their objectives are. They understand what they need to do. That's one piece of connectedness. The second piece is do I know what the strengths of the other players on my team are? Do I know what they're good at so that I can go to them when I have an issue or a challenge? So the second piece of connectedness for your direct team is around how well do I understand the strengths of the other players in my team and who I need to go to when I run into a challenge or a problem. Third piece is, do I have a way to contact those people where they'll respond and help me with whatever issue I have in a timely manner? If they're responsive, I get what I need, I'm able to solve my problem. Again, another layer of that connectedness and your score on how connected is that team. And again, when you get into each components of that, you can actually measure, yep, when people reach out and make requests, 9 out of 10 times those requests are fulfilled in under 30 minutes, right? Someone's responding, getting them the information, they're able to do something with it and move on. Those types of things are what we look at in terms of connectedness. We'll talk a little bit more about some other ways to measure it, but a key factor for anyone right now is understanding how connected are you to the teams. If you are more connected, the results will be better for your teams. So what's interesting about data and how we see it today is there's a lot of data that we have access to. So we all saw it with the thing with Facebook getting in trouble. Everyone is collecting and capturing metrics all the time on all of us, right? There's lots of data out there. It's just the challenge of sifting through what's important and what's not, as many of you asked, like what should I measure, what shouldn't I, how do I get through all of that? There's a lot of data out there for us to potentially look at and decide what to do with. And it's overwhelming for most of us. We just don't know where to start. So I'll let Rick kind of go through some of the examples of technology as we've moved along.
So when we talk about data in that last slide, we were talking about, there's a lot of data out there and there's a lot of things we're missing. So for instance, when I have this image up, you guys all know what this is. This is an iPhone. This was something that was actually data metrics that were captured. When they came up with the conceptual idea of putting the iPhone together and creating the first smartphone, and it doesn't have to be the iPhone, it can be any phone. We can debate about which one's was the true first one and go back to BlackBerry if we want to. But there was a massive amount of data that was captured before they actually got to this design. And it was all about him, the companies gathering data, looking at the needs and the wants. And if I look at even going back into the Windows world and PCs, there was a massive amount of data that was captured. And, for those of you guys who know the story of Bill Gates and how he came up with Windows in college, he did quite a bit of extensive research of his own personal experience that people just weren't looking at the flaws in the data need that he was able to see. Going back even further, the first automobile that came about, that didn't come about when they first talked about making, horse-drawn carriages go faster. They said add horses or get bigger horses. And that's where they were able to actually look at the first cars and say, hey, what if we do something different here? There's a way we can go around horses and be faster and move quicker. And even going back to the light bulb, there's multiple attempts to get the light bulb, but before it came about, everyone was fine with a candle, and there was all the different data that was out there. And we can even go back to this one, which is very hard for me to see because I can't see the room of everybody's faces. But with this one, this is actually Alexander the Great. He didn't come up with this battle plan and become one of the best, come up with one of the best generals' ideas for a battle. This took him months of data gathering, if not years of gathering data to come up with a way in how he can take something which was very common. And back in that time, it was number of soldiers. If I have more soldiers than you and I march at you, I will win. He found a way to take that data and look at the patterns and the troops and see their movements and see how they respond to different situations to come up with a way to take a smaller army, beat a larger army simply by doing things slightly different. And that's what we're talking about, also stepping away from the data. Get away from it for a minute and viewing it from that fresh set of eyes of, not having your preconceived notions tied to it. That's where we start getting sucked into data. So the one thing that's in common with all of these examples is time. These took massive amounts of time for them to come up with these ideas. And these are just approximations. The iPhone it took longer than 5 years to actually create it, but this was what they created for themselves. It was approximately how long it took them to go through and analyze that data to come up with a solution. So one of the questions I love to ask is, kind of a proof of how we're missing data in a situation that we're a part of is, I'm guessing everyone who's listening is running Agile. I would be surprised if someone's not running Agile. But how many of you actually think it's a good fit for your organization? Guessing a handful, maybe less than everyone.
Well, I mean, the funny thing is that the folks that came up with the name of Agile, who doesn't want to be Agile? Would you rather be slow and clumsy? You know, so
Yeah.
it's hard to say, you know, I don't want to be Agile, but go ahead. Sorry. I thought that was
No, it's all right. I love interruptions. They make these better when we're interactive. But the last question here is, of those people who thought it's a good fit for your organization, to actually analyze and do an analysis and look at strengths and weaknesses of other delivery methodologies and settle on Agile as the right delivery methodology for your organization. You know, it's, you know, the way I like to say it is, Agile can work in our situation. We can absolutely make it work in a situation, but so can every other methodology out there. One methodology that can do everything better than everything else. It's about your overall goals that you're trying to achieve and what you want. So as I talk about this, a lot of people go, well, other than Agile and Waterfall, for those of you who haven't sat through really boring comp sci classes like I have, you may not know very many other ones. Sorry, oh, sorry. So with this, when you go in saying we're going to just do Agile and that's it, and we make that decision, and it's not even a conversation, you're really limiting what you are going to do and your capabilities as an organization. This can slow you down, and it's a simple decision, and we missed a lot of potential data to gather, and it could hurt the organization moving forward. It's not the right delivery methodology we should be using. So this is a list, which is kind of what I was alluding to a little bit earlier, of just some of the top 7 methodologies that I can know off the top of my head. There's a lot of different, but you know, some of these might be better for your team based on personnel, your organizational goals, what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and a lot of something more like the prototyping model, right? So depending on the
Hey, Jennifer, we can't hear you too well.
Oh, yep, there you go. Is this better?
Yep, that's good.
All right, depending on the type of industry you're in, depending on what your goals are as an organization, you may move to a different model for delivery, or you may use combinations depending on which area of your business it is. So for example, I was talking to a group that said we need to be faster to market. We need to make sure that we're iterating quickly on what doesn't work for our consumers. So we really need prototyping. Like, prototyping is what we need. We need to get to working models. We need to then iterate on it. If it doesn't work, we're actually going to give it a specific amount of time frame that we'll give it to be successful. If it's not, then we're going to abandon and move to something else. So that may be more effective for you even than some of the other ones. But kind of the point Rick was making is, a lot of times one of two things can happen. Either we're not using any data, right? So we didn't gather any information and just made a decision because it seemed like what everyone else is doing. It seemed like the right thing from a gut feel perspective. We just knew we needed to do something different, right? Whatever it was, we make sometimes these emotional-based decisions as opposed to decisions based on information, facts, and data. So what we would recommend for all of you, out there is saying, if you're not doing anything, if you're not tracking anything, if you're making just kind of those knee-jerk reactions, gut feel reactions, is to actually, especially on critical things, step back and say, what data did we actually use to determine if this is the right thing or not for us? Because just because it works for someone else doesn't mean it fits you. And that's one of the biggest mistakes we tend to find in organizations is someone said, oh, well, I talked to these 6 companies and they're doing this, therefore I must be doing this or should be doing this. When in reality, what the risk tolerances of those other organizations is different than yours. The delivery model is different than yours. The product that they're actually producing is different than yours. And I'll have Rick give a quick example of that where we've real-time seen this in one of the folks we work with.
One of the clients that I've spent a lot of time working with is Target. And for those of you guys remember the Black Friday outage a few years ago? I hope there's heads nodding yes. Hard to see them. But I was called in after that outage happened to help come in and be a part of the analysis team to figure out what actually went wrong how did it happen? Because everyone had test results. Everyone had looked at their apps and programs and systems and made sure everything was working. And as we started digging into it, what we ended up finding out was the previous year and a half before that outage, they had a new CIO come in who had said, we are taking this company in a whole new direction and every team is shifting to an agile methodology. And everyone has to go this way and we're going in this fashion of agile and this is how everything will be done organizationally. And it was a global shift for the organization. But one of the things that they didn't do was understand that the network and security team was running in a very efficient waterfall methodology, making sure that they were able to do full load and capacity tests before every major release. When they switched to the new 2-week sprint model, those tests they didn't have adequate time to do those tests, and they lost the ability to have those test results come up, which is how they ended up getting to where they were. So for any of you guys that don't know what happened to Target on Black Friday a couple of years ago was they had an entire corporate seizure, if you will. Every system locked up and basically 404'd on them. Their cash registers were down, their website was down, all their apps were down, their inventory tracking systems were down, everything went down. And the only way they knew how to get things back online, they had contingency plans for every one system going down, but nothing for all the systems going down either. So the only thing they could think of to do was a full power cycle of their corporate systems in the office, which took them about an hour and a half to get everything back up and running. So they had entire register lines with people with carts full of sale items, and this was at 11 in the morning, where they had these full carts with people with hundreds of dollars they were going to purchase, just sitting in the aisle waiting to purchase, but the registers were down, and they couldn't even open the register to do the transactions manually. That's how bad it was. So they were fully locked out, and it took them roughly 2 hours total to get everything back up and running. But they lost, I think they estimated $2 billion worth of revenue in that time frame. It was a huge issue for them. And simply because they made a global decision without doing a full analysis of, does it make sense for us to do this for everyone? And I'm not bashing on Agile, and I think Agile is great. But it was just a corporate decision that was pushed down to everyone without adequate data and a true understanding of the extent of what that was going to do to them across the board.
And then the next one, so we use just as examples because they're relatable to everyone and most people understand at a basic level that they want to do something with this. So like Phil said, most people go, Agile, why wouldn't I want to be Agile, right? So that's why we use it as one of the key examples to get your mindset around, you know, there's still risks, even if it seems like the most logical thing to do, that you should at least evaluate it and use some base level of information to make these decisions. So again, we'd ask the same question, right? How many of you are looking to implement or have implemented some form of DevOps culture in your organizations? I'm guessing if we asked you, most of you would say, even if you're not doing it, that you're saying, I want to move that direction. It's, again, one of those things where if you look at how many jobs are posted out there, and we'd love to say this, that even Rick and I were at a conference in Vegas, what was it, maybe 7 years ago, 5 years ago, 5 years? 4 or 5 years ago, and we asked just in that class, even 4 or 5 years ago, right? It's more prevalent now. How many people were hiring someone with DevOps background, right? Almost everyone in the room said, we're looking at someone, or we want to hire someone, we're moving this direction. And then the next question we asked was, well, what is DevOps? Do you know what DevOps means, right? And everyone put their hands down and they're like, I don't know, but we must need one because everyone else needs one, right? And that's the trend we get into, right? Is a lot of times we'll make decisions because we think it's what everyone else is doing without saying, does it really make sense for me? And is this the right thing? So back to what do you measure and what don't you measure? You got to understand what the pain points are for your organization and what your organization looks like and what they need, which could be very different from what your peer organizations or other people need. So DevOps, when we look at that, we go, what are you trying to solve? And the two things we say is, do you have an issue with speed? So getting things through quickly. And I'll give you an example of that. We had someone say, hey, I'm manually testing everything right now. And I can move the code through really quickly, but when it gets to where we need to do some testing, we go all hands on deck. We have 8 people. It takes them 40 hours of 8 people to do the testing we need to do to get comfortable to then move it to production. So the idea is, okay, how do we improve the speed, right? There's a way to do that. So let's look at ways and methods to actually not create bottlenecks. So it'd be something to the effect of looking at your value stream analysis and saying, from idea to implementation, how long does it take you, right? As an organization, when you come up with a great idea of something that the organization, the product, whatever you're doing needs, where you go, wow, this is a great idea, we need to put this in production. How long does it take you to get from that idea all the way out to the end consumer? And if you look at that, you're naturally going to find where you're spending more time. And then you say, okay, if I optimize that, or if I sped up, where are the points that are kind of choke points or bottlenecks currently, and how do I improve speed? The other answer is I can't scale. So I have an organization, I can get stuff through the pipe, but I'm not able to scale to the number, to the capability that I need to based on how many people we're servicing. So I need to increase scale and getting out to a larger consumer base faster and scaling up. So those are two things we look at when we say, does this make sense, right? So we measure how quickly are we delivering and can we improve that? And what is our ability to scale if we need to? And how much can we scale and how quickly? So two things we would look at in terms of that. Now here's something interesting, right, to show an example of this. With what we see is they're okay with an 80% failure rate of their ideas. So 80% of the stuff they come up with that they actually implement can fail, and they'll survive as a company. So a lot of people go, well, I want to be like Amazon, because Amazon does things super fast and they're super innovative, and they're using all these new technologies, and they're in the cloud, and they can spin up environments, and they're scalable, and look at all the stuff they're able to do. Well, the answer is, does it make sense? And are you a company, if you look like Amazon, you operate like Amazon, you create your infrastructure like Amazon, that if 80% of what you push out fails, that's okay, right? And that's where you have to go. The same metric Amazon uses may not be your metric, right, of what's required and what makes sense for your organization. Now, some companies go, yeah, that's where we want to be. We work with organizations that say, if I have an issue or if I find an issue in production, I fail forward. I don't go back. So a lot of us remember, if you've been in development or testing or technology a while, it used to be you always had to have your plan for if you put a release in and it went badly enough, you could make a call to revert back. And you would load the last build that you had, put that code in, figure out what the problem was, and then try another implementation or release of that same code. Well, what we're finding now is some companies, depending on what they do, it's faster for them to actually fail forward and leave the defect in production, put a fix out, put the fix right in production to cover up whatever the problem was, and fix it in production, right? Different strategy. What I would say is, if you're my pacemaker company and I need a pacemaker, I wouldn't want you to fail forward. I'd rather you not put it out and we figure out what the problem is before we have an issue. So different strategies depending on different products. You guys probably fundamentally get the idea with that. And then the other piece of that is we need to start looking at data a little bit differently than how we've probably looked at it in the past. So the same paradigms that we used to have don't necessarily always apply the same way as we move forward, and we have the ability to track data. So depending on how old all of you are, some of this may make sense to you, but Rick and I both remember growing up and our parents saying stranger danger, right? Like that was a thing. Like that phrase was burned in our minds of strangers equal danger, right? You don't go with strangers, you don't get in cars with strangers, right? We probably grew up also with parents that grew up in the 70s and 60s, and you hitchhiked all across the country and it was totally cool. So our parents maybe even had a different paradigm, but through that taught us, don't get in a car with a stranger. Do not pick up the phone or answer the phone if you don't know who it is. And don't go into a stranger's home. Like you would never, I don't know how many of you ever had to sell cookies or whatever for sports, but if you walked up to a house, it was like, you absolutely don't go in. If they invite you in, you stay outside. It's not safe once you get in their house. Don't do it. Right? So maybe you can relate to this, but now look at our paradigm today. Now we do Uber and Lyft. We're essentially getting in cars with strangers every day and allowing them to take us places. we are allowing strangers into our homes. So I don't know if you guys know WAG or that middle icon, but it's basically a service where you allow people into your homes to take your furry loved ones, and they walk them during the day while you're not home, and they're taking your pets, relying on that they will actually return that furry creature and not steal everything from your home while they do it, right? So again, very different. We're letting people into our homes. Not only that, we have Airbnb now where we actually go and stay in strangers' homes, right? People we don't know, we're signing up to actually go stay in their homes and, you know, be at those homes. So again, we've shifted the mindset from stranger danger to, ooh, we have a little bit of data, right? Uber has a little bit of data on their drivers, so does Lyft, right? And we're going, because I have a little bit of information, I now all of a sudden trust strangers. And strangers are good. And we use strangers when we need them to help us get things we need, like getting from place to place, or staying somewhere that's cheaper than a hotel, or walking our dogs so that we don't have to have pet sitters that are just at our house all day long. And then Waze, how many of you use that, right? Allowing other people and trusting that they're giving you accurate, valid information about which way to take on your route. Where the accidents are, all of that, we're crowdsourcing to strangers, basically data that we then use as fact and trust. So again, that's that shifting paradigm of now that we have a little bit of data, we've shifted and said, no, I trust people, even though they're strangers, I'm going to trust them because I have a tiny bit of information about them. So different paradigm than what we were used to. Now, when we talk data, you have to then be able to trust the data you're producing. And when people question it, which they ultimately always do, because the natural inclination of most people when they start to see data is, how valid is it? How did they collect it? Did they think of this, right? So when you start producing metrics and data, you have to be confident that what you're producing is good data, that it's defensible, that the sources that you're using are reliable, that they're accurately tracking the information, that there isn't issues with the quality of the data that you're actually using to publish the information out to other people. Because if people stop trusting your data, it causes even more questions, right? They're going to dig deeper on everything because they've found a fundamental problem, or they've questioned something, you couldn't answer it, so they dig a little deeper, and then they dig a little deeper. So before you start publishing data and information, make sure you trust that. The other thing to know is, just because everyone else is doing it and it's best and brightest technology that's out there doesn't mean that equal latest to you, right? So going away from what we discussed earlier of being those herd animals, where just because everyone else is doing it, we should probably do this too. With your data, you really want to be saying, does this make sense for my organization and the pain points that we're experiencing, that this is a way that I want to represent where our organization's at and where the pain is. So Zappos, anyone out there familiar with Zappos and holacracy as a strategy?
Never even heard the word.
Holacracy. Okay, so this will wreck you for the rest of the afternoon. So holacracy was a strategy originally that Twitter adopted. And Twitter at the time when they adopted the strategy of holacracy was about a 6-person company. Grew to about 12 at the time when they were small. So not Twitter today, Twitter in its infancy of what they were developing. And they said, we should adopt holacracy, which means there are no formal titles. There is autonomy. Everyone can make decisions. All ideas are valid. Every person has the capability to come up with something. There is not the same structure. So it's the extreme of self-guided teams. We've all heard the term self-directed, self-guided teams for Agile. This is the extreme of that. This would be, you don't have a CEO, you don't have a leader or a manager, you don't have a director. We're all just humans that are doing work, right? So the executive at the time of Zappos, the CEO who owned the company, read this book on an airplane and got back to Zappos and said, we're going to implement this. At the time, Zappos was approximately 2,000 employees. So basically what he was saying is, all 2,000 of you, once we implement this, you all are equal people. We don't have job titles, so your job title's gone. So you could have been a developer, project manager, you have no job titles anymore. You're all assigned a certain dollar value. Each of you, based on your role, what you've done in the past, will be given a certain budget to work with. With that budget, you can decide what teams you work on, what projects you work on. No one will mandate what you do, how you do it, what that structure looks like, what you're trying to do, right? So now you have this budget. Teams will actually self-form. So if someone has an idea, say for example at Zappos, to paint the website blue. Someone will go, I want to paint the website blue. I need 2 developers, a QA person, and a Scrum Master. It is their job to go get 2 developers, a QA person, and a Scrum Master. Have those folks bring their budget with them, fund that project, deliver it to production. At the same time, another team could say, we're self-forming and we want to form a team that's going to paint the website red. They could go get developers, go get people, paint the website red, develop all the code, and you ask which one wins? Literally the last one to push code to production is how that would work. Very easy when you're a 6-person company because you're all probably talking to each other. In a 2,000-person company, little bit more of a challenge on structure and how you actually manage holacracy in that environment. Rick and I met with all their project managers or former project managers as this was being implemented. We're leading, large scale initiatives at Zappos. And literally what this would mean is they no longer had the title of project manager. They would have some budget assigned to them. She went into the CEO and said, what does this mean? What do I do? And he looked at her and he said, I don't know. What do you want to do? Literally, right? So I equate it to if we were all in corporate America, kind of caged animals who live in a cage and we make sure we get food and all the things we need, all of a sudden they opened the doors, let everyone become free range, and no one had the skills or the capability or the training to know how to operate in that manner, right? They're now wild animals with no training to be wild animals. So a lot of things happened at Zappos. They obviously had to evolve the strategy. The point is, just seeing a strategy that worked for a 6-person company in Twitter at the time, and then applying it universally to a company that's 2,000 people with a much different operating model with different numbers of people, didn't operate in the same manner and fashion, right? So again, just saying, oh, it worked here, let's do it here, isn't a strategy we would recommend for a lot of people. You actually have to say, how would this actually work? As Rick likes to say, they probably didn't read the last page of the book, which said, and it failed miserably, right? So when we actually went back a year later, all of the project managers were gone from Zappos. They had chosen to leave, right? Because the CIO left almost immediately when it was announced. He saw it not as a strategy he wanted to employ as an organization. All of the project managers except one had left. The one that remained was only there because when this was announced, he had only been working at Zappos for about 30 days. And so he was like, you know what, I just started a new job, I gotta give it a try, right? So again, keep in mind as you implement new things, the actual implementation of that. And then the other piece of that, as this is Rick's quote, so I'll let him do it.
Well, I've always said with that, the holacracy idea is never trust a single data point. We never know if that single data point is a rarity in flux, if it was a unique situation that doesn't apply to me. Never trust a single one, both on technology and personal levels. Absolutely. I always ask for multiple and look for a trend. Look for a pattern. Don't trust points.
And then the other thing too is a lot of companies, we need to be innovative. We need to try new things. We should always be looking at changing and innovating. And one of the interesting things, right, if you actually look at Google, which a lot of us would say Google's pretty innovative as a company, they've managed to survive. That actually is the 1999 site of Google, right? And then if you look at Google today, they haven't changed a lot, right? So if it works, don't break it, right? In certain cases, if what you're doing is working, don't change it just for the sake of change. Know that you're changing it because that is actually what you need. You need to improve that it's become stagnant. People are no longer responsive. They're not using it, right? So if you actually ask, and I used to do this in a lot of the trainings I would do, is how many of you use Google every day, right? And almost everyone raises their hand. Google is something that the majority now of people use every single day. right? So Google's like, why break it? Like everyone's using it, it's fully implemented, people love it. We'll innovate in other spaces. One thing we don't want to mess with is how people search on Google. But when you look at a company like Apple, two very different ways they deal with how to make changes, right? Apple's all about the customer experience and innovating, and they don't keep any experience very long. They're constantly asking their consumers to adapt and take on new technologies. Apple doesn't allow you to be so many versions back, right? You always have to be moving forward, and they're forcing you forward with innovative new things. And they rely on the fact that the people that are loyal to them like the fact that they're being pushed to these new technologies, facial recognition, right? When we saw that come out with Apple. Apple was the first smartphone. Everyone else then copied it. The iPads and the touch technology. Everyone then comes out with it. Apple knows their place in the market is the leading edge of innovation. They know people will trail them and come out with other products that are probably similar with cheaper cost, that other people will use, but they know that the people that they've got are the ones who always want to stay on that cutting edge of innovation and technology, so they're going to pay the premium for the cutting edge technology and innovation. The other thing I would say, make sure when you're looking at decisions that are getting made around either personnel, around how to do releases, around data of what you're delivering, that you're making informed decisions versus emotional decisions. A lot of time what we will see again is people going with emotion over information to make decisions that are actually fairly critical in the organization, right? So the target example Rick used earlier, you want to use some data to drive how those decisions are getting made versus just going, oh my gosh, we have to fix it, let's do this, and no one's thought it through. So again, being careful about asking yourself when you're in those situations, hey, do we have any data that says that this is the right thing to do? And it doesn't have to be reams of data, but a little bit of information goes a long way as opposed to no information. And then people are data too. So one of the other interesting things, and I know Philip has a passion around this as well, is using data points people, right? So data and who do we hire, right? Hiring is a big decision. There is a lack of talent in the market space right now. Evaluating how people are actually performing in the market space, really important. Predicting the ability for people to be successful in your organization based on how you operate and you run. So one of the tools that we've been looking at that I encourage a lot of you to look at, which I think a lot of HR organizations will be looking at in the future, is actually analytics, where you have some intelligence built in that says, if we were to look at everyone in this role that is performing at a high level today, is very successful, let's profile that against the new people we're bringing into the organization to say, how well do these new people match what we know already works in our teams and our organizations? Are they similar? Do they test out the same way? Would we evaluate them the same way? And allowing that intelligence to sift through all of those resumes, the things that you get, and honing in on the right people for your organization. So choosing the right people and the right skills for the search, how you interview would look very different, right? So using artificial intelligence, now imagine using AI, assist in hiring the right people, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably
match the people that are successful and then match that up to my organization. So again, I think more of what we'll be seeing in the near future. Oh, was there a question, Philip?
No, I was just going to say that's probably, one of the critical decisions that people don't realize. They, when you fail at doing that right, it costs thousands of dollars. So.
Oh yeah, like I'm surprised. So this is the space where there are companies that will actually test employees the way we test software. So today we spend a lot of time testing software, and we've all probably been through that interview process where it was like, oh, take this psych exam and profile. So we make sure if we're under high pressure situations, you're not going to jump off the building, right? Those type of things have been done for a long time, but that's still about human intervention. You're talking to a psychologist who's hopefully evaluating you, that understands what you're like, and then they're some type of measure into that, but people look at things differently. Now imagine if you had an algorithm or analytics that looked at 100 people, looked at 2,000 people, looked at 200,000 people, and could compare all of those, right? The ability to get it right would be much higher if you're using that level of analytics, the same way Watson does with comparing, say, a doctor, right, to get a result on a diagnosis. Watson's looked at hundreds of thousands of cases that look similar to yours and getting you a diagnosis. A medical doctor looked at, I've seen 10 of those in his career, maybe 50, right? But not to the magnitude that an artificial intelligence system can do it. That's the magnitude of difference, right? When comparing the learning that it can do versus an individual, and then evaluating those consistently without bias, because all of us as humans naturally put bias into decision. So too much of anything is not good. What I was glad to hear in the beginning, many of you gave us overwhelming numbers of metrics. So that means that's good. You're not measuring everything under the sun. Rick and I go into organizations where their metrics that they track on a daily, weekly, monthly basis are pages long, right? So we don't want the paralysis. We want to get the right ones that fit. So this is what we were talking about earlier too. In evaluating your teams, you want these counterintuitive metrics to make sure you're not just measuring one way. So this gets to what should you measure that you guys were asking. So for example, a lot of organizations will measure velocity. How quickly are we getting things through and into production? The problem is if you only measure velocity, you're not taking into account challenging versus simple requests, and it'll skew it so that certain team members may go, I'm going to pick up a gazillion really tiny little things. And then the other team members who really like those big meaty challenges will take on these really big stories, but it'll take them a lot longer to do. So when you look at how much they're outputting for stories, the number of stories is much lower if you're just looking at velocity. So you also want to look at average story points per story, because then it tells you a story about, wow, this person has great velocity, but that's because they're picking up things that have 1 or 2 points, like they're small things, versus someone who's picking up something that's worth a ton of points, right? So if you're measuring velocity, measure something else that'll give you that other indicator. Otherwise, as we all know, people game the system. Not intentionally always, but it happens with people. And then I'll have Rick talk about the next couple about just some other metrics that would be good to track with velocity.
So a couple of the ones that were asked is what are some of the good metrics that you guys like? And myself personally, I am a huge fan of the DRE, defect removal efficiency. I love tracking that in accordance with my velocity. For those of you guys who are not familiar with DRE, it is pretty much, to break it down in the most essential version, we're really tracking the number of defects we're seeing moving from environment to environment within our own organization. So it's very similar to the defect escape rate, but with a little bit more analysis on how are we trending as an organization. So when you pair that with velocity, it will show you that DRE shows kind of the quality of code we're pushing out versus how fast we're moving code. So again, it's a counterintuitive data points. And I also like to move into kind of the different, more changing how we're like not showing just graphs because it gets very old. So I like to do different images to distract people. So this one is escape bugs versus throughput. That's another great kind of pairing that I like to work with together. And the last one, I usually do a prize if anyone can gather and guess this one correctly. It's all images, but this one is DRE again versus your release cycle time. But these are 2 of them that I really like, or 3 examples of different models that I like to use consistently to measure the effectiveness of our teams. And then I know
Hey,
And we're gonna, go ahead.
I know we're almost down to the end here, but don't go too fast because this is all the good stuff. So
Yeah.
really appreciate. I hope that the audience is a little bit patient because we're really into some good stuff here. Keep going, guys.
So what we would say too is looking at predictive behavior and how you use data to drive, because when you start looking at patterning, right? Patterns of what's happening and predictive indicators that tell you, here's what our pattern looks like, and then looking at that over time. So you want to put that time factor into it of the predictive of, we've seen this before in the past, here's the pattern, here's what that usually means. And so one of the things to note, one question was, what do you do at different levels? What I will tell you about executives, is they prefer to have visuals. We process pictures 50,000 times faster than words, okay? So just absorb that for a second. In your mind, if I were to show you a picture of an apple, like a physical picture of an apple, versus a paragraph about describing an apple, which one do you want? Right? The picture. Executives have so much on their minds and they process 50,000 times faster pictures than words. It's critical to give them a picture, not just send them, here's what the defect removal efficiency is, here's what our velocity is. Show them that in a picture of what that looks like. So pictures speak a lot louder for executives. Then there's also team versus individual data and gathering those statistics. So I'll let Rick talk through those. So he's going to let me do it. So how you gather data, what the data points are, and managing them, right? So if you just look at individuals versus teams, you can get metrics that don't accurately reflect what is happening. So what you want to do is look at it also as a whole and say, how is the team performing, not just this one individual, so that you're not driving it and saying all things are equal. Different people in the team will have different roles, as I mentioned with that velocity. Not everyone's velocity is going to look the same in terms of that. And then what you want to look at is indicators versus actuals. Is it just an indicator or is it an actual result? And a lot of times where we get hung up is indicators versus actuals and understanding the difference between those two. So ask yourself in any pattern that you're analyzing, is it actual or is it just an indicator that it could happen again in the future, okay? So something to look at. Visualize your data, we mentioned that. So these are just some ideas of how to visually depict what is going on. Different dashboards have more visuals. If you're dealing with executives, the more visuals, the better. If you're dealing with the direct team who deals with us on a regular basis, you can have a very different way that you look at it. So you don't have to look at it the same depending on what it is. But again, looking at it from the perspective of who is the target audience, and the more senior they are, the more executive they are, the more important it will be to use visuals, and more visuals than numbers that make sense to them. And make sure your data tells a story. That's the other piece, right? We want the coloring book version of data. So again, looking at what's going to tell your story. And these are some of the things to look at that are pretty common. And again, whatever one you pick, make sure you pick another one that's counterintuitive. So again, if you're doing velocity, you want to maybe then also do average points per story, churn or story points. If you're doing code coverage, you want to do another one with that. So there's a lot of tools that measure code coverage, but you don't want to just do code coverage. You want to make sure you have another metric that tells the story besides just, yep, we've got a lot of code coverage. The other one that we watch a lot that a lot of people used to use was a metric around lines of code. That was an old metric that a lot of people used to measure developers. So whoever produced the most lines of code was viewed as the most efficient. Rick will tell you stories of, because of that, developers would put extra carriage returns, spaces, all kinds of things in their code to inflate the number of lines of code, but it wasn't actual code. And more lines takes up more space, right? So that having to go back and remove those spaces because you have all this memory that you're utilizing and taking up, you need to take up. So the idea is whatever metric you land on, if it's velocity, if it is code coverage, if it's number of releases QA signed off on, have something else that gives you another picture or another piece of that story of what was going on, right? So it tells you another piece of that story for you.
Jennifer, here's a question here. So one of the participants asked about automation coverage earlier. So what do you think would be good to match automation coverage with? What other metric would you match that with to tell a story?
Yeah, so when you're measuring automation coverage, one of the things I would ask, I'm assuming what you're doing with automation coverage is what percentage of the product has automation Is that valid? Is that what that means?
Yes.
Okay. So if I assume that it means if I have an application and I have 40% automation, right, for coverage, so 40% of the application has automation and 60% doesn't, what I would also want to see with that is for that 40%, what level of tests are those, right? Are they unit tests? Are they system tests? Are they integration tests? Where are those happening? And then for manual testing, what is the code coverage of our manual testing? And then where are those broken down by? Is it system test? Is it integration test, right? Where are those? So that you get a full picture and story. Because one of the things we heard with automation was some people say everything should be automated. We should be 90% automated or better, right? But if you don't tell that whole story, there are real organizations where because of the complexity or the way that they're structured or their environments, you'll never get to 90%. 40% may actually be the top level that you'll ever get, right? So when we all hear 40%, we think of it usually in terms of grading. And if I get 40%, that means I'm failing, right? But that may not be the case in your organization. 40% may be 100% of what you can do. That makes sense?
Yeah, if I could just supplement that a bit. I mean, I think the goal really is to just get rid of defects, find them and get rid of them. And so, you know, I think what you could do is you could pair the automation coverage with your ability to remove defects. So, you know, if you increase from 40 to 50%, but you don't get better on getting rid of defects, then you obviously didn't help you any. So I think that's probably one of the things that you would want to look at.
Yeah, and that can be waste, right? So again, looking at it and saying, well, 40% isn't good. Well, why isn't it good? Is that because there's a lot of outstanding defects that we're missing that are outside the automation coverage that we have?
Right.
And then the cost of those, right? Because there can be defects, but if those aren't impactful or not important to your stakeholders, right? And it's not important to the consumer and they're just annoyances, is it worth it, right? So the cost of those defects.
Yeah.
And then we won't do that exercise because we're at time, and then we were at questions. So like I said too, we left our email and phone number too if you need to get a hold of us, if you have questions that we didn't.
Yeah, why don't you go to the last slide? I just wanted to thank all of our participants for you know, getting on the webinar and being with us, as well as making a great contribution. Can you go to the last slide, Jennifer?
Yeah.
In terms of asking questions, because you know the questions is what really makes the webinar.
Yes, I agree. I'm going to see if it'll go to the end for. There we go.
But just to let everyone know that first of all, thanks to Jennifer and Rick, and also that the webinar has been recorded, and we will post it on our YouTube channel. And the other thing is that you know, if you have other questions, feel free to ask them, and we will make contact with Jennifer and Rick and make sure they get answered. So thank you very much, everyone, and especially thanks to Jennifer and Rick and sharing your knowledge. And hopefully we can get rid of that fake data and at least know where it is and not pay attention to it.
Perfect. Thanks, Phil, for hosting. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We enjoyed getting a chance to engage with you today.
Yeah, thanks very much.